Let me just start off with a couple of short vignettes. So in January of 2008, the New York Times reported on their front page that 50% of the surgeons who were involved in an FDA IDE study that led to the approval of this artificial lumbar disc had an equity stake in the industry sponsor. More than that, the value of their financial interest would be significantly affected by the outcome of the study. They stood to make a lot more money should the artificial disc be approved by the FDA, which it was. And a year later, when the paper appeared reporting the results in Spine, the nature of this financial stake in the industry sponsor could not be ascertained by this small little disclosure statement right here. So this leads to one of the issues of disclosure. In May of 2008, a qui tam whistleblower suit was filed in the federal jurisdiction of Massachusetts, alleging that 143 spine surgeons accepted kickbacks in the form of consulting contracts, royalties, patents, fees, honoraria to purchase or to recommend purchase Medtronic products in violation of the Stark Law and the False Claim Act. Further, it was alleged that these physicians functioned as compensated agents through their significant financial interests in the company of Medtronic rather than functioning as they should as objective faculty, and therefore illegally promoted the off-label use of BMP. And this occurred at various venues such as CME meetings, VIP seminars, training courses at the Mary Institute in Memphis, as well as in publications. In 2005, a Department of Justice investigation was instituted of the orthopedic industry. This originated out of New Jersey. There were 5 orthopedic companies that were charged with improper financial inducements to surgeons to use their products, in this case hip and knee replacements. 4 out of these 5 companies signed deferred prosecution agreements that would last for 18 months in 2007, which required them to come under federal oversight with a Department of Justice appointed monitor, as well as continued disclosures, compliance officer, and independent review organization development. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, and this is just a variety of things that I've taken off of the web or from the United States Senate, from the New York Times, from various publications, really beginning to look into the relationships that surgeons, other physicians, academic medical centers have developed with industry over the years. And I'm going to talk about how we got here and what some of these issues are. So the real questions I think that you have to ask as it relates to those 3 instances that I showed, where did the nature of these relationships harm patients? Did it threaten the validity or the integrity of any of these study results or the educational content of the meetings? And ultimately, did it undermine the public trust in our profession, in our scientific investigation, or of the physician-industry collaboration at all levels? And I think the broader question is, does industry involvement in training, in education, and research threaten the integrity of our specialty and undermine the public trust in the medical profession? And I think this latter question relates really to the very foundation of what it is that we are as a medical profession and what our status is as medical professionals. And here I've just kind of defined, our profession as a collectivity of practitioners that are trained in expert knowledge and skills that is not available to the general public. And in our case of medicine, it's really the health and the well-being of both patients as well as their societies. We're endowed, obviously, special power and obligation to practice and advance our field. And professionalism is really the necessary attributes that we need to have in order to adequately function as medical professionals. So as medical professionals, we are granted extraordinary privileges by society. And just to give a few examples, we are allowed to do harm in the service of healing. We are allowed access to patient private information. We can have physical contact with patients that otherwise would be illegal. We're given a great deal of professional autonomy to define our standards of care, to determine the science and practice of our specialty, as well as determine and control the education, both of future physicians as well as continuing medical education for established physicians. And we're giving a great deal of latitude with respect to self-regulation for our professionalism and our ethics. But with privilege flows obligation, and these obligations are inherent in what we define as the attributes of professionalism, and I've just kind of listed them here. One is competence. You hold yourself out to be competent both in terms of your skills and your knowledge for what you profess to be. There's a commitment to lifelong learning and self-assessment. You have objectivity and validity of your science and your practice, and altruism. You're always going to act in the patient's best interests. Now, at the heart of professionalism is really the physician-patient relationship, and a lot of people have just kind of described this as a moral covenant that really forms the basis of our medical profession, and it's generated through patient illness, and it's based kind of on the trust in physician and the profession by both the patient as well as society. Without that trust, such a covenant really does not exist. It's also important to understand that it's only we as medical professionals that have this relationship with the patient. Industry doesn't have this relationship. And I think only we understand what it means to be a medical professional. Only we have the responsibility to faithfully serve this relationship. And in many ways, I think the standing of our medical profession within society depends almost more on the public trust in our values and our ethics than it does in our skills and our knowledge, which is much more easily standardized. Now, we have a lot in common, and we are aligned with industry in a lot of our objectives and their objectives as well. For example, the advancement of medical technology is clearly something that industry is aligned to do. Safe and effective use of technology, we have no problem with that. And research and education, I mean, their interests are our interests. But they have certain objectives that conflict with our own. I mean, there is a distinct profit motive and to increase shareholder value. Their job is to present their product in the most favorable light. And so when it comes to investigational devices, FDA approval, they're out to prove, not investigate their device. And that's a distinct difference and sometimes can be in conflict with what we are within the medical profession. Now, obviously, for the academic medical center as well as a physician, we have very clear objectives. I mean, it's the patient health and well-being, the validity and the objectivity of our science, as well as the public trust. But we have to admit we also have some conflict as well, even within our own practice. Surgical practice is often seen as a business. We are paid for procedures, kind of procedure-based reimbursement through the CPT codes. And if you look at an academic medical center, they will frequently say, hey, look, without a financial margin, we can have no mission. So there are those profit motives, there are those financial issues that also can conflict with professionalism of our profession. So there's a number of different concerns then that arise from the relationship between industry and the medical profession, both at the individual but also at the academic medical center level. When you think about it, medications, devices, and technology are produced by industry, not by us. On the other hand, we are the ones who are legally approved to be distributors of these medical products. Industry knows this, and they're going to market to us. And by the very effect of their marketing, it's intended to influence the behavior of the physician. And it's no secret that industry has used our educational platforms as a very effective marketing mechanism. Through education, to be sure, but it's certainly attempting to influence the behavior of the people who are legally empowered to dispense their instruments. So, the magnitude of industry-funded research and education has really exploded over the last several years, and currently industry funds over 60% of biomedical research in the United States, over 70% of clinical trials, and over 50% of the nearly $2.5 billion per year spent in continuing medical education is provided for by industry. So, and this relationship has extended well into the academic medical center, beyond just the physician. 60% of department chairs have a financial industry with industry, either as a consultant, advisory board, or speaker. Over 2/3 of departments have relationships and get money or some deal of support from industry. 20% have intellectual property ownership, licensing agreements such as patents or royalties, and over 90%, no surprise, accept gifts, samples, and meals. So it's really permeated throughout the academic medical center. And so there's a concern that this increased dependence on industry for education and for research and patient care is going to create a fundamental conflict because of the different objectives between industry and the academic medical center, a physician. And this conflict will lead to kind of the erosion of the ability and the public confidence in the academic medical center and us to carry out its core mission of advancing knowledge and science, of training and educating the next generation of physicians, and taking care of today's patients. So this was a major concern to the Association of American Medical College, and they looked into this, and they said, it's important that the skills and knowledge are taught within the academic medical center and medical school and residency, but professionalism is also taught, values, ethics, judgment, altruism. These things are part of the curriculum. But there's also a hidden curriculum. I mean, the medical students and the residents see these relationships, and it may be that, if they see industry and physician relationships that are maybe a little bit too cozy, they begin to, see that there's an erosion in the principles of our ability to teach professionalism to the next generation of physicians. And ultimately, this would spill outside of the academic medical center to undermine our credibility with the public and the authority of the core mission of the academic medical center with respect to their missions of education, training, research, and patient care. So how did we get here? Well, it's interesting, NIH opened in 1930, and it's evolved over several decades. And 1930 was the time when research was believed to be a public good. It was something that the public thought we should be involved with. The problem was this occurred right after the Great Depression, so there wasn't a lot of money to be had, and so there really wasn't much in the way of funding of the NIH between 1930 and the Second World War. However, between 1947 and 1974, the NIH budget exploded from $4 million to just over $1 billion, but it was purposely limited to basic science, and there was scarce industry sponsorship of any type of kind of translational research. So in about the 1970s, what happened was there was a tremendous erosion of the amount of public monies that was going to NIH. I mean, there was inflation, there was competition with Medicare, Medicaid for the public health dollar. And there was a real fundamental debate over the value of basic research that was being done by NIH, as well as goal-directed or translational research. And it was generally thought that the public research done by NIH really ceased at a point where the invention entered product development. And it was seen the job of the private sector, not academia, to develop diagnostic and therapeutic as well as preventive products to bring them to the market to actually improve public health. Now, it was also true in the 1970s that the federal government owned and licensed all technology underwritten by federal funding both within NIH as well as extramural funding at academic medical center. So there was no incentive to develop, to market drug, device, or process if you couldn't control it. So actually 98% of federally financed technology was never commercially developed prior to 1970. That changed dramatically with the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980, and this actually permitted institutions and individuals to now own intellectual property that was developed through federally funded research. Now institutions, investigators, they could claim profit from the sale of products, devices, and processes, and this was seen as a positive way to put your knowledge producers together with your knowledge users to improve the public health, to stimulate translational research, to improve the economy, and to revitalize university research. This was followed up in 6 years later with the Technology Transfer Act, and this now actually allowed technology transfer of intramural research to industry through license and patent agreements of research actually done on the campus of NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. So this exploded, this relationship, over the next 2 decades. In 1990, for example, 90% of companies with life science research had relationships with universities. Over 2/3 of United States universities held equity in companies that sponsored research by their faculty. University income licensing royalties increased from $121 million in 1991 to almost $1 billion by the year 2000. And the NIH budget expanded from about $7.5 billion to $27 billion over a 13-year period because of this positive view of the government funding of now translational research. But there began to come some clouding of this and some concerns about the industry-academic collaboration, particularly to the degree that it had developed in the 90s and the early 2000s. And these concerns were related to, the profit motive of industry versus a duty to the patient and science, particularly as it related to safety threats to human subject research, the validity of research findings, the public trust of research investigations and institutions. And curiously, the once open dissemination of research findings were now being restricted within patent applications. So the government tried to deal with this a little bit. They tried to establish standards to ensure that the design, the conduct, and reporting of research funded under federal grants would not be biased by conflicting financial interests. This was passed in 1995. required conflict of interest statements to be filled out to try to define financial relationships and what significance meant, and require regular disclosure, monitoring of COI committee, and develop mechanisms to manage, reduce, or eliminate conflict of interest. And I think most of us in this room are familiar with those issues. And they really began in 1995. But these were applicable only to NIH-funded research, not industry-sponsored research. There was very vague language, and it was concerned only with study validity, not really patient safety. And there was no guidance on, well, how do you manage these conflict of interest? It was one thing to disclose them, it was quite another to try to manage them. And you could see, this was a paper in JAMA, I think, where they looked at the top 10 medical schools who received the largest amount of federal funding. And you can see how inconsistent the adoption of federal regulation was within these institutions, particularly as it related to which interest would be prohibited for here. You see that there was a very low compliance, so it really didn't have that much teeth. Later on, the FDA did require financial disclosure for industry-sponsored research for the FDA ID trials, and this was done in, as I say, 1999, but it was even weaker than what was done for NIH. It was the industry sponsor, not the academic institution, that was required to collect the data. The financial interests were reported only after the research had been completed, and they had greater financial amount exemption. There was really no requirement for a comprehensive system of disclosure oversight. No surprise that this was abused to a great degree. And so, when it came to industry clinical trial concerns, there were a number of them. First is they're often performed to facilitate and get regulatory approval of a drug or specific device rather than test a hypothesis. The physician investigators who often had little or no input into the study design, no access to the raw data, and limited participation in the data interpretation, and they also had a financial stake in the study outcome. And a survey of a number of medical schools showed that the research agreements rarely ensured full participation on the part of the investigator with respect to the study design, access to the data, as well as the right to publish. It was rare that there would be data safety management boards or independent executive publication committees. The industry owned the data, and they could publish it and manipulate it in any way they want. These concerns kind of vividly came to a head and had a face put on them with the death of this patient here, Jesse Gelsinger. Many of you remember he was in an FDA phase 2 industry-funded gene therapy trial in Philadelphia. The university, as well as the lead investigator, held private equity in the industry sponsor. There were clear conflict of interest, protocol violations, and lack of conformed consent. This led to the suspension of all gene therapy trials, and there was a gene therapy trial, and there was a civil settlement of $10 million, at least in his case. I actually went to the website of the representative of their family, put this right. Although it was a case of high profile, it was an easy legal victory. So the Association of American Medical College looked at these issues and came out with this kind of a white paper here and basically said, look, patient welfare is really the primary concern, and conflict of interest may affect patient welfare. And so they developed this term, this concept of rebuttable presumption. If you had any significant financial interest, say above $10,000, you were presumed not to be allowed to be involved in your research or in that research unless there was a compelling circumstance. But the compelling circumstance would be determined by each individual institution on a case-by-case basis. They required other safeguards to be put in place, as noted here. But again, you can see that as you look through these surveys, these were only incompletely adopted by academic medical centers throughout the country. I showed this paper this morning. The one I have some difficulty with, the Prestige trial. I went to the website on conflict of interest at the primary investigators institution, and they state here very explicitly, faculty are almost never allowed to serve as principal investigators on clinical trials. And in this case, this investigator clearly was allowed. This is, we all have them. This is the Columbia one. And I just want to turn briefly to the to industry relationship with us as individual physicians. And the collaboration occurs at many different levels, from the concept, the development of a device or a technique, the assessment of it in an IDE trial, the regulatory getting approval from the FDA, surgeon education and training to coverage decisions. So it's a broad relationship. And it's critical, particularly in spine surgery or in any kind of medical device, because devices are not drugs. Surgeons help design, develop, and refine the device and technology. We don't just test them. We actually put them in. We don't just prescribe them. So they're tools. They're not simply treatments. And it's important for us to not only develop and determine the indications, but to train and educate the surgeon how to do it, when to do it, and in whom to do it. So the relationship has to exist between industry and physicians, particularly in spine surgery. And we would not have these innovations here that I've listed here without important industry relationships. A number of those folks are here in the room today in these endeavors. I mean, spinal surgery has benefited tremendously from this robust relationship over the years. Again, these financial relationships can take multiple different formats, as you see here. The problem is that these relationships can develop what are called a conflict of interest, and that's defined as a set of conditions in which the professional responsibilities concerning a primary interest may be unduly influenced by a secondary influence. And that secondary influence is the financial one, and the primary interest is determined by our professional duties of a physician or an investigator, and that is patient welfare and safety, integrity of our research, and maintenance of the public trust. So conflict of interest is not, it's a condition, it's not a behavior. It's determined by this circumstance, not by the outcome. And we tend to focus on financial conflict of interest because they're discretionary. They're a matter of choice, they're objective, they're measurable, and they're widespread, and we know that they have pernicious effects. And it's deemed to be present when there can be a reasonable determination that a significant financial interest could affect professional judgment. So the issue with financial conflict of interest is they're not inherently bad. They're trying to determine what their relative effect on the primary interest. And so our role is not so much to eliminate them, but to prevent a significant financial interest from an effect or the appearance of effect on our professional responsibilities. But the problem is there's no way to know whether the primary interest was improperly influenced by a significant financial interest. And so the issue with respect to industry-physician relationship is not so much an issue of honesty as it is an unconscious bias. We have a belief of technology, we have goodwill toward sponsor, so that we're out to prove, not simply investigate, when it comes to the evaluation of a device or a technique that we're involved in developing. And so this may affect or appear to affect the study design, patient selection, clinical care, data collection, interpretation, reporting. And when it comes to financial conflict of interest within the medical profession, there's a high bar. I mean, the mere appearance of conflict between the financial interest and our professional responsibility can weaken the public confidence in the physician, our profession, and in our scientific investigation. So why do we regulate conflict of interest? Well, one is we want to maintain the integrity of our professional responsibilities, to limit the effects of the secondary interests, but also to acknowledge the difficulties in assessing these effects. And we want to maintain public confidence in our profession, to reduce conditions where reasonable people, such as patient or colleagues, may believe that professional responsibilities have been influenced by financial conflict of interest. And we have a number of different ways that we've tried to manage these: disclosure, abstention, divestiture, prohibition, independent data oversight committees, to minimize or eliminate investigator role in recruitment and informed consent and data collection, analysis, and interpretation. Disclosure is the most common method of management of conflict of interest, and it allows those affected or in a position to be affected to assess the risks and the bias to make their own determination regarding disclosed conflict of interest. In other words, this is the transparency issue. But it's a myth. First, it's unverified. You have no way of knowing if any of those slides that we showed this morning was accurate with respect to the detail that was presented. It places the burden completely on the end user, the patient, the public, or a colleague who may not be informed enough to assess the risks and the bias of the presentation. And even worse than that, simple disclosure, it's often kind of spuriously believed, absolves any conflict of interest to concern, so that the presenter, once he or she has said, these are my conflicts, after they get past slide 2, it's like, okay, there's no further conflict of interest. It's been managed because I've disclosed it. And for the learner, it creates a false sense of security and objectivity of the educational content. I mean, somehow it's washed over the fact that there might be a conflict of interest. So do we see bias in industry-sponsored research? Here's from the spine world, retrospective review of 527 articles in spine for a year and a half. Industry-funded research was 3.5 times more likely to report positive results than other sourced fundings. Outside of the spinal surgery field, we see that as well. Industry sponsorship was 3.5 times more likely to report pro-industry conclusions. This is the drug from Big Pharma, 74 FDA studies on antidepressant trials. 37 of the 38 FDA studies that had positive results were published. Of the negative studies, only 3 were published. 22 were not published, but 11 were published with positive spin. So they're truly trying to control the message, although they will tell you that they only will study, industry will only study the most highly selective and most promising technology. They'll use only the most experienced investigators. And the randomized prospective study design with objective outcome analysis really preclude any bias by industry or the investigator, and I think what I've mentioned this morning is I don't think that's true. And the potential bias occurs at a lot of different levels in design, patient recruitment, data collection, interpretation, reporting, and publication. Here you see, here's the BRYAN disc. These were 2 identical publications that occurred in 2 separate peer-reviewed journals. I mean, this is a real no-no, within a couple of months of one another. These you saw this morning from, I mean, just saturated our peer review platform presentations at a variety of our meetings. And the potential for bias is particularly problematic in spine because of the patient heterogeneity and the subjective patient-reported outcomes, moderate treatment effects, and the surgeon is part of the treatment, and he or she is involved in the assessment. The problems with that randomized prospective trial, the placebo effect, the nocebo effect, the bias, the participation here, we went through that. And so these can have significant effects. Now, there are some solutions to use independent data committee access to all raw data, to have clinical trial registries that Zoe talked about a little bit this morning, to prohibit involvement altogether, investigator with significant financial interests. Disclosure we talked about, to try to insulate the investigator with a significant financial interest from all data collection and analysis, and use independent statistical analysis. I mean, make sure that industry does not just have the sole access to the data. So to conclude, I think it's important that you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think principled partnerships with industry have advanced the science and practice of neurosurgery and spinal surgery to the benefit of our patients and society. There's no question about that. But there's also no question that there is bias in industry-funded research and education that does undermine the integrity of our profession. And adherence to fundamental professional principles of competence, integrity, altruism are probably going to be the most effective way to mitigate these concerns. But the first goal is to recognize that they exist. Disclosure and individual responsibility for financial conflict of interest, they're just not sufficient. There's going to be the potential for bias, and it's pervasive, and there's ultimately no way for a reasonable outsider to know whether and to what degree there's been an effect on the primary responsibility by the financial conflict of interest. And when it comes to the public trust, external perception is reality. And the perceived conflict of interest of an individual puts the entire profession at risk. And ultimately, it's a struggle we're going to have to try to balance the incentives and the need for innovation and advancement to improve patient care versus protection of the patient integrity as well as scientific investigation and the preservation of the public trust. So I think I'll end there, and thanks very much.